You all would have noticed that the proponents of capitalism like to claim that communist regimes in the 20th century murdered around 100 million people.
Well, I'm not sure what the exact numbers are, but there is no doubt that communist regimes did in fact murder scores of people throughout the 20th century. I mean, that's what Karl Marx calls for. That's what happens when you have class warfare. What happens is you get purges and class warfare and classicides. There's no denying the Red Terror under Lenin and the purges under Stalin and the Cambodian genocide under the Khmer Rouge and the landlord classicides under Mao Zedong and Red China, the landlord classicides in Vietnam, and all of the starvation as a result to economic planning in these countries. So, again, I don't know what the numbers are, but there's no doubt that these communist regimes did in fact murder, again, scores of people.
They make this claim repeatedly because they think it gives them moral superiority and a justifiable reason to dismiss Marxist ideas.
I mean, looking at the history of communism alone is enough to dismiss Karl Marx's dumb ideas. And because if you can take ideas and then project what it looks like when taken to their logical conclusion, as I've said, there's this misconception. I made a whole video about it last year, or was it the year before? Doesn't matter. That there's this misconception about communism that it sounds good on paper, it's a good idea in theory, it just never works in practice because some brutal dictator just comes along and ruins it for everyone. But if you look at Karl Marx's ideas and look at the consequences of those ideas, you can kind of connect the dots. So what I say is that communism has been tried right every time it's been tried. And that's why communism is a horrible idea. It is not a good idea in theory. It's a horrible idea. That's why it has horrible consequences.
For example,
you said you're a communist, which, does have...
Which gives me the moral superiority. Capitalism is freedom, communism is slavery. That's all I need for my moral superiority.
Does have a death toll of 100 million people in the last 100 years, so shamelessly tell us what countries work so well under
Go on this claim you often hear the radical leftists make about communism, about Marxism. They say, well, that wasn't real Marxism. It's like, okay, well, how many countries do you need to disprove your thesis? How many millions of people have to die before you might admit that you're wrong? Well, obviously more than 100 million, because that's the approximate total. That's probably an underestimate, but we'll be conservative, because adding another 10 million doesn't really make that much difference.
Notice how these writers treat the 100 million death figure like it is a historical fact. Peterson, without a shred of evidence, was even willing to increase the death toll.
How is this guy any different than these alt-right doofuses who say, well, the Holocaust happened. I'm just not sure if it was if it was as many as 6 million people who died in the concentration camps. This guy's making the same argument. Yeah, there was a lot of slaughter under communism. He's just skeptical. He just thinks the numbers might be a little too inflated.
Death toll in order to strengthen his point. This alone should tell you that these people don't care about historical facts, just political point scoring. For example, to back up their claims that 100 million people were killed under Marxist governments, they tend to cite the Black Book of Communism, which is where the 100 million death figure comes from. Now what these right-wing propagandists of course ignore is the fact that this estimated death toll was heavily disputed by academia. In fact,
academia was disputed by academia. Yeah, many of whom are probably Marxists, because as we all know, there's certainly a shortage of Marxist intellectuals in academia.
In fact, criticism even came from the contributing authors of the book, such as Nicholas Wirth and John Lewis Magolan, who publicly distanced themselves from the 100 million death count figure. Wirth and Magolan even accused the primary author of the Black Book, Stéphane Courtois, of being obsessed with arriving at the total of 100 million killed. So those who cite the 100 million figure are simply taking advantage of poor...
Kind of like how Marxists are obsessed with how much money other people have.
...poor and sloppy scholarship. Now, even if the Black Book's dubious figure was true, this wouldn't give right-wing pundits the moral superiority they so desperately crave. The reason for this is that the death toll of capitalism, the economic system they love and support, would have beaten communism's alleged death count many times over. Now, before we discuss the deaths caused by capitalism, we must define what capitalism is. Capitalism is an economic system that is based on the private ownership of the means of production and their operation for profit. It is characterized by wage labor or forced labor if they can get away with it.
Incorrect. His definition is not exactly correct, especially the last thing he said. Capitalism is a political system where the government only protects individual rights and property rights, leaving individuals free to voluntarily exchange goods and services. Now this idea of forced labor is slavery and is antithetical to capitalism. Forced labor is a clear violation of individual rights. So no, that would not happen under a true capitalist country. And I know this guy's a Marxist, so it's not really surprising that he's dishonest.
Producing for the purposes of selling, aka commodity production, and of course capital accumulation. The capitalists themselves are those who own the means of production. What are the means of production?
Means of production are somewhat of a weasel word used by Karl Marx, whose followers think that ideas don't matter and that ideas are irrelevant and that nobody has a right to the products of their mind. Because what is the means of production? What else would be the means of production? So if Henry Ford figures out how to not only build a reliable automobile, but how to efficiently mass produce them using his mind, then shouldn't he have the right to produce those automobiles? So after he figures this out, after going bankrupt twice or three times, he finally figures out how to mass produce it using a variety of machines and assembly lines, that anyone in society and everyone in society suddenly has the right to knock off his ideas and knock off his mental productive effort, just steal his ideas and copy and paste them. I mean, that's what communism calls for. That's essentially what Marxism is. It's a war on reason. It is a war on mental productive effort. It is a war on the mind.
The industries that produce goods that the capitalist tries to sell on the market for the best price he can get. As for the workers, they must accept the conditions set by the capitalist or go hungry.
No, again, this is not true. Anyone under capitalism is free to do whatever they need to do. Workers are free to go live and produce for themselves on a subsistence farm, pursue a career of subsistence farming. Again, as I mentioned in a previous video, a lot of people left the farms and fled to factories because subsistence farming is really tough and it's a really hard life. Workers also have the option to go work for other employers. Workers have the option to save up and open their own business, start their own business, invent their own products. Nothing's stopping them from inventing their own products.
This gives the capitalists great control over the workforce. Therefore, under capitalism, you will find
control over the workforce. Again, everyone in capitalism has control over their own life.
You will find that the owners of the means of production can fulfill their needs many times over, whilst others cannot. Of course, in order to defend such inequalities, the capitalists either need a powerful state or a private army to maintain their economic power.
Private armies, again, there are no private armies under capitalism. You might be able to have private security, but you cannot use your private security force to go invade other people's property or invade other countries. Only the government has the right to use force in a capitalist society.
Therefore, it is easy to conclude that capitalism is based on the pursuit of naked self-interest.
Yeah, everyone should pursue their self-interest. That's what makes capitalism great.
In fact, the so-called philosopher of capitalism, Adam Smith,
The philosopher. He's the only one, folks. Adam Smith. He's the only philosopher of capitalism. There's been no other philosophers of capitalism since 1776 when Wealth of Nations was published.
Believed that an individual acting in their own self-interest can unwittingly benefit society as a whole. To quote Smith directly, "The rich consume little more than the poor, and in spite of their natural selfishness and rapacity, they divide with the poor the produce of all their improvements. They are led by an invisible hand to make nearly the same distribution of the necessaries of life which would have been made had the earth been divided into equal portions among all its inhabitants, and thus, without intending it, without knowing it, advance the interests of the society, and afford means to the multiplication of the species."
Yeah, and there is, even though the utilitarian premise is the wrong way to argue for capitalism, you guys should argue it from a view that everyone has the right to be selfish and live their life. But the utilitarian argument, it's absolutely true. When people are free to pursue their own happiness, by mere virtue of innovation and mass production of goods and services that drives down the cost of living, the standard of living eventually goes through the roof. There's more opportunities for jobs. There's goods and services become cheaper and more plentiful. People, because of electricity and oil lighting, people are able to stay up later through the night and work on stuff, study harder, innovate, work longer hours, and be even more productive. So yeah, there is truth to what Adam Smith says, even though it's the wrong premise.
Now, whilst one could argue that people acting in their self-interest could create incentives and promote innovation, it is hard to deny that this mindset has also caused the death of millions.
Are these pictures from... Where are these pictures from? Are these in capitalist countries?
In both the 19th and 20th centuries. In fact, capitalists pursuing their own interests has led to a great...
And look at this picture of there's a little baby that wants water, and that this greedy businessman is just holding the hose. Isn't water cleaner and more plentiful today thanks in part to greedy corporations that are trying to bottle and clean water so that they can sell it at a profit? If you go into Walmart, go into any Walmart or any grocery store in America, you can buy a whole case of bottled water for like $2 or $3. That's what, 20 minutes on a minimum wage job, you can have a whole case of water?
To a great misallocation of resources, exploitation, and of course, mass death. Furthermore, capitalists have also shown no hesitation using...
Yeah, look at these capitalists. Adolf Hitler and Gustav Krupp and the Nazis. Yeah, the Nazi Germany was the pinnacle of laissez-faire capitalism. Get the fuck out of here. The Nazis were explicitly anti-capitalist. In fact, the communists in Germany pragmatically aligned themselves with the Nazis because they thought, hey, we'll get rid of capitalism. We'll team up with the Nazis to get rid of capitalism in Germany, and then we can settle our differences with the Nazis, which just tells you that communists hate capitalists more than they hate Nazis.
Using the power of the state to crush those who are a threat to their economic interests.
And by the way, if there's any communists watching, please tell me if I'm wrong. Who's worse, Nazis or capitalists? Who do you think's worse?
Interests, whether the threat comes from Marxists, trade unions, indigenous people, or even landless peasants. So how should we calculate the death toll of capitalism? Well, it is clear that we will...
How should we calculate the death toll of capitalism? Pay attention, folks.
We will never have an exact number, but we can certainly say that...
Never have an exact number. Notice he's so skeptical of the 100 million statistic associated with communism, yet he doesn't have an exact number. And now he's trying to say, well, the death toll of capitalism is high too, but we don't have exact numbers. This guy is framing this argument the wrong way. Maybe he just wants to focus on this topic. But if he's trying to frame the argument about which has a higher death toll, he can't even win the fucking argument because he doesn't have exact numbers.
Certainly say that it runs well into the hundreds of millions. German academic Thomas Pogge estimates that in the 15 years after the Cold War, 270 million, 18 million a year, perished due to terrible poverty. This includes those who have died from poor sanitation, starvation, and the lack of medical care.
So, alright, I'm going to keep playing.
Now why is that the fault of capitalism? Well, we live in the era of neoliberalism, where the world is one large market, so capitalism is completely global. Big capitalist multinationals dominate the world economy, and capital easily flows across national borders. Furthermore, modern industry, controlled by capitalists, produce more than enough food and other essential goods to completely end world hunger and poverty. Yet this does not happen. Why? Because under capitalism, the world's impoverished citizens are not seen as people who need desperate help, but rather as unpaying customers who cannot afford goods and services. After all, it is in the capitalist self-interest to derive profits from their assets, using their great economic power to help the desperately poor.
Now, notice how insane this framing is. He says that since the Cold War ended, he uses a statistic saying that within the 15 years after the Cold War ended, 270 million people throughout the world died due to starvation, poor sanitation conditions, or lack of medical care and supplies. And he says that these are all a result of capitalism because capitalism is now worldwide. Now, put aside the fact that this is all wrong because, one, this is a lie. Two, there are sanctions between various countries. Three, there are tariffs between various countries. Four, there are embargoes between various countries. Five, there have been wars since the Cold War ended, even right after the Cold War ended. And also, there exist several countries that are explicitly anti-capitalist. That whether or not they're socialist or communist or some form of theocracy that explicitly rejects capitalism and Western countries and dealing with them. That's like saying that Sharia law is worldwide because there are Korans and mosques in every country throughout the world. It's an insane way to frame things. Also, how much of the world is capitalist? Even the most capitalist countries in the world are still mixed economies. And if you look at the Economic Freedom Index, I think 25% of the world's countries, probably less than 25%, are considered mostly free, while another 25% or more are either mostly unfree or completely repressed. Yet this guy wants to act like, capitalism is just running rampant throughout the world because money, global trade is more prevalent than ever, and because money is flowing through various different countries. That doesn't mean the whole world is capitalist, you fucking dishonest idiot. It's also interesting to note that his starting point is the end of the Cold War, which brings an interesting question. Would the millions of these alleged capitalist deaths have been avoided if the Cold War had not ended? If the Soviet Union still existed, would they be running around, would Russia be running around with all of its riches to all of these developing countries where there's no food, there's no, where sanitation is lacking, where health care is lacking? Would they be running around the world just handing out roasted turkeys and cheeseburgers to all of the starving people in these developing countries and rescuing them with medical supplies and doctors and whatnot? No, because Russia couldn't even stock their own fucking grocery stores in the 1980s. Imagine this guy being in East Germany when the Berlin Wall fell. I know you guys want to reunify Germany and that this communism stuff hasn't been working and has been pretty shitty here, but hear me out. Millions of people in developing countries are going to die over the next 15 years. Oh, what about East Germany? Oh, things will probably get better in Germany, but we can't allow Charlie Kirk and Jordan Peterson to score political points on us in 30 years. Also notice that he's making a big fuss over numbers. He's not denying the fact that mass murders and mass slaughter and purges ever occurred in communist countries. In fact, it happened in every communist country. It's also worth noting the distinction between capitalism, as Ayn Rand defined it, and communism, as Karl Marx defined it. Ayn Rand called for government to leave people alone and only to protect individual rights and property rights. Karl Marx, on the other hand, calls for class warfare and forcible overthrow of social conditions. Even if we were to count every murder that occurred in a capitalist society, even a mixed economy, it would be dishonest to attribute them to capitalism because they're being done by individuals in a free or relatively free society. In fact, it's government's proper role to apprehend and punish murderers, partly as a means of preventing further murders from happening. Karl Marx, on the other hand, called for class warfare and violent revolutions and dictatorship. So it's totally legitimate to cite death tolls and starvation statistics and other data because that's what Karl Marx explicitly called for. Anyway, I'm going to link to the video down below for anyone that's curious to watch the remainder of this garbage. But it's not really worth my time to continue given the insane framing of how he calculates alleged deaths under capitalism, not to mention the remainder of the video is full of strawman arguments and context-dropping situations.